The crown was heavier than she expected. Isolde stood in the hall of Aravel with blood on her sleeve that was not her own, and 300 elves watching her as if she were a stranger wearing a dead woman's face. Behind her, the throne. Before her, the silence of a court that had spent 11 years telling her she would never matter. "Kneel," someone whispered. She did not know if it was an order or a prayer. She did not kneel. Somewhere beyond the broken doors, a man she loved was bleeding into the snow, and she had perhaps 4 minutes left to decide whether the title they were about to give her was worth what it had already cost. She looked at the faces watching her, nobles in silver and deep green, house banners hanging from the rafters in colors she had memorized long before anyone trusted her to know their meaning. And she understood, with the kind of clarity that only arrives when there is nothing left to protect, that she had been in this hall 1,000 times before. She had moved through it with her arms full of linen, her eyes trained carefully downward, invisible in the way that only servants learn to be truly invisible. Not hidden, simply beneath the threshold of being worth looking at. She had touched these walls. She had polished this floor. She had stood in the far corner and watched other people live the life she had trained herself not to imagine. And now the hall was full and still, and every eye in it was on her. 4 minutes ago, she had been nothing, a name spoken with a curled lip, a girl who set tables and emptied basins, and was never, not once, asked to sit at either. 4 minutes ago, she had not yet made the choice that would either save him or save everyone else. She lifted her chin. The hall went quiet enough to hear the wind outside and the snow against the broken doors. And somewhere beyond all of it, the sound of a man she loved paying for her assent in a currency she had not asked him to spend. This is where it ends, or where it begins. Even she did not know yet which. To understand how a girl with no name worth remembering came to stand in that hall with the weight of a kingdom pressing down on her shoulders, we have to go back, not to the blood, not to the broken doors. We have to go back to the kitchens. Isolde had learned very young the particular cruelty of being unnecessary. She was the daughter of a minor steward who had died owing favors he could never repay. And from the age of 7, she had lived in the household of House Varel as something between a ward and a servant, fed and clothed and tolerated, and never once asked what she wanted. The Varels were old elven nobility, silver-haired and long-lived, the kind of family that measured worth in centuries of bloodline. Isolde's blood carried none of it, or so she had always been told, or so she had for 11 years believed. She remembered the exact words Lady Varel had used when she was 9 years old, standing in a hallway too cold for a child in a thin dress, waiting to be given a task. Lady Varel had been speaking to her daughter's governess, her voice carrying the effortless ease of a woman who had never needed to lower it for anyone. She's not unkind. She's simply unremarkable. Some children are born for nothing in particular, and the kindest thing one can do is not pretend otherwise. It had not been said cruelly. That was the part that stayed with Isolde for years. The gentleness of it. The way one might note that a winter sky had no color worth remarking on, and then look away to something more interesting. Unremarkable. She turned the word over for years the way a river turns a stone, slowly, patiently, until every edge was worn smooth, until it was no longer an insult but a mirror, until she could no longer remember a version of herself that existed without it. By the time she was 20, she set the long table for feasts she was never invited to attend, running her fingers along fine cloth, placing crystal in its precise position, making everything beautiful for people who would sit there and never once wonder who had prepared the room. She mended hems for cousins who called her the steward's girl, as though steward were an insult, and girl the kindest word they could manage. She moved through rooms the way water moves around stone, without disturbing the surface, without being seen to disturb it, because being seen in that house had only ever brought her harm. What she wanted, she told no one, not even herself, most nights. But it surfaced sometimes, in the dangerous hour before sleep. The brief, terrifying imagining of a life in which someone looked at her and saw something worth keeping. Not a queen. She had never let herself want that. It would have been absurd. She wanted something smaller and somehow infinitely harder to hold, to matter to one person, in one room, without having to earn it first. What she feared was simpler and far more present. She feared that Lady Varel had been right, that she had looked into Isolde at 9 years old and seen correctly a girl built for nothing in particular, and that every year since had been the slow confirmation of that verdict. She feared growing old in that house, mending hems until her hands forgot how to do anything else, until even her own name felt borrowed. There had been one cousin once, Brienne, a few years younger, showing Isolde a careless warmth before she was old enough to understand the house's hierarchies and be educated out of them. For a season or two they had been close enough to be called friends. Isolde still remembered the exact afternoon it ended. Brienne, perhaps 11, casually repeating something she had overheard her mother say, that staff and family did not truly belong to the same world, however much time they spent in the same rooms. That mixing them only created confusion about what people were for. The sentiment had landed with the flat finality of a door closing, and Brienne had moved on to another subject, without appearing to notice that anything important had shifted. Isolde had spent every year since understanding precisely where she was allowed to stand in any room, and how far that line extended, and never once testing its edges again. It was a Tuesday, though the elves did not call it that, when Lord Varel's head steward informed her, without looking up from his ledger, that a guest would be arriving from the Eastern Holdings before nightfall. She was to prepare the smaller guest chamber, the one no one used. The good rooms, he did not need to specify, were reserved for people who mattered. She did not ask who. She never asked who. Asking implied she had a right to know, and rights were not something extended to girls like her. She simply carried the linens down a corridor she had walked 10,000 times before, with no notion at all that her life was 4 hours from ending and beginning in the same breath. The guest arrived with no banner, no escort worth mentioning, and a wound along his forearm he had clearly tried and failed to hide beneath his sleeve. The household received him in the courtyard with the cold formality reserved for guests of uncertain standing, precise enough to satisfy obligation, bare enough to communicate condescension, and then dispersed, satisfied with having performed their duty without genuinely extending themselves. Isolde had watched from the upper window with the detached attention she brought to most things in that house. A man, a traveling coat that had once been fine and been worn too hard to remember it. The careful way he held his left arm slightly away from his body. She found him afterward in the small guest chamber itself, sitting on the edge of the bed she had made that afternoon. He was staring at his own hands, with an expression she recognized because she had seen it in her own reflection at the end of long, useless days. The look of a person who has been performing a version of themselves for so long, they have temporarily forgotten what the original looked like. She had come to bring water for the basin. She stopped in the doorway. "You're not the servant who was assigned to me," he said, not unkindly. "I'm the servant who was assigned to the room," she answered. "You happen to be in it." It surprised a sound out of him, not quite a laugh, but its nearer cousin, involuntary and warm. He looked at her properly then, with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who wanted to understand what they were looking at. Not the assessing glance that wealthy guests sometimes gave her, evaluating usefulness, but the way a person looks at another person when they are genuinely curious. No one in that household ever looked at her that way. She did not know what to do with it, except stand very still and not break it. His name, she would learn, was Lucian, second son of House Varel. a name spoken in that household with the particular distaste of a family that had backed the wrong claimant in a war 3 generations past and had spent every year since paying for it in diminished standing. Lucien himself had compounded the family's disgrace more recently. A refusal, a defiance of his father's wishes, an exile dressed up as a diplomatic posting, so no one would have to call it what it was. He did not explain the wound. She did not ask. But when she saw him wince against the pull of his traveling case, she simply pressed a clean folded cloth to the wound without asking permission or offering explanation. Her hands knew the work before her mind had fully decided to do it. He let her. He watched her face while she worked, not her hands. And the attention felt so different from every other kind she had ever received in that house that she nearly said something, then stopped herself, unsure what she would even say. "You're very quiet," he observed. "I've found people prefer it that way." "I don't," he said. Just that. 2 plain words, offered without performance, and something in Isolde's chest moved sideways in a way she did not have language for yet, like a door that had been stuck for a very long time turning unexpectedly on its hinge. She left the room that night, telling herself it meant nothing. A wounded stranger, a single conversation. The accident of proximity. She had survived 11 years in that house by refusing to want things she couldn't keep, and she was not about to undo that in one evening. She was wrong. She did not yet know how wrong. 3 days later, Lord Varel summoned the household to announce, with visible and barely managed distaste, that the Eastern envoy, meaning Lucien, would be remaining through the turning of the year. The High Court had requested it in writing. For reasons Lord Varel did not understand, and clearly resented not understanding. The High Court's seal was on the letter. There was nothing to be done. Isolde stood at the back of the hall where she always stood, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope, exactly. Hope required believing something good might happen to you specifically, and she had trained herself out of that particular delusion years ago. It was closer to curiosity, a small, precise, dangerous curiosity about what it might feel like to be noticed by someone who had no reason to look away. That night, walking the upper corridor with an armful of linens, she found Lucien at the window that overlooked the eastern garden, the one no one used, where the roses had gone wild because no one had cared enough about inconvenient beauty to tame it. "They're going to make me stay," he said, without turning. "I'm told I should be grateful. Are you?" He turned, and the look on his face was not gratitude. It was something closer to relief, sudden, unguarded, directed at her with a specificity she felt in her collarbone, as though she were the first person all day who had asked him a real question and he hadn't been prepared for how much he wanted to answer honestly. "I might be," he said, "given time." She did not know yet that his exile was not what it appeared to be. She did not know that the High Court's interest in him was not diplomatic at all, but deeply personal, tied to a promise made before either of them was born. She did not know that the wound on his arm had not come from where the household assumed, or that the secret he carried would eventually unmake everything she thought she understood about her own life. She knew only that for the first time in 11 years, someone had looked at her and not looked away. She walked back to her small room that night and lay awake long after the candles had been put out, turning over a single, terrifying question, one she had never once allowed herself to ask before. What if Lady Varel had been wrong? What grew between them did not announce itself. It arrived in the smallest currency available to 2 people who were not permitted by rank or custom to want each other openly. A held door, a second helping of bread left within reach without comment. The particular silence of 2 people in the same room who have stopped needing to fill it with talk. Lucien began finding reasons to be where she was. He told himself, at first, that it was the estate's smallness, that a man confined to these grounds would naturally cross paths with its servants. He stopped telling himself that within a fortnight, when he noticed that his reasons for walking the eastern corridor always seemed to align, with suspicious precision, to the hours Isolde carried linens there. She, for her part, told herself nothing at all. She had survived this house by refusing to examine her own wanting too closely, and she did not intend to start now, even as she found herself memorizing small things about him without meaning to. The way he favored his left hand when he thought no one watched, the particular quiet that came over him whenever someone mentioned his father, the fact that he thanked her by name every time, as though it cost him nothing and her name was worth the using. No one in 11 years had said her name like it was a word worth using. He began asking her things no one asked her, not what needed doing. The household was full of people who asked her that, but what she thought, what she wanted on the rare evenings when the house was done with her, whether she had ever wished to leave, to see the eastern coast, to be anywhere that did not already have an opinion about who she was. "I don't let myself want things like that," she told him once, in the wild rose garden, the one place on the estate that felt genuinely unclaimed by anyone's judgment. "Wanting is expensive here. You pay for it later. Who taught you that?" She considered the question, not the answer. She knew the answer, but the question itself, the simple directness of it, the implicit suggestion that it was something she had been taught rather than something that was simply true. "Everyone," she said, eventually. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I think you've spent so long being told you're nothing that you've started agreeing with them, just to make the noise stop." No one had ever said anything so precisely accurate to her in her life. She did not know whether to be grateful or to weep, so she did neither. She stood very still, and he did not push her further. And that, the not pushing, the willingness to simply leave the truth sitting between them without demanding she do anything with it, told her more about him than any words he might have said. There were small sacrifices that meant nothing to anyone watching, and everything to the two of them. He took a reprimand from Lord Varel, rather than let her be blamed for a broken crystal vase she had nothing to do with. She covered for his absence one evening when he slipped away to send a letter he would not explain, lying smoothly to the head steward, and felt, strangely, not like a liar, but like a person choosing someone, making a deliberate, unrequired choice to place herself on his side of something. She thought about that all night afterward, but even as something warm and unspoken settled between them, the obstacles were gathering quietly at the edges. Lady Varel had begun watching Lucien's movements with the particular sharpness of a woman identifying an opportunity and calculating how to close her hand around it without appearing to grasp. Isolde understood the calculation with a cold drop in her stomach. The family was already imagining a marriage, Lucien's, to one of Lady Varel's daughters, a match that would restore House Terran's standing and elevate House Varel's position in the same stroke, the kind of arrangement that did not ask either party's preference, only their compliance and expected gratitude for being chosen at all. And there was the letter Lucien kept sending east, week after week, without reply, handed to a courier at the side gate rather than through the household's own channels, until one evening, a reply finally came. She found him in the garden that night, reading it by the estate's upper windows. He stood very still, his face arranged in the expression of someone receiving news they had been dreading long enough to have rehearsed their response. The color had left his face the way warmth leaves a room when the fire goes out, completely and all at once. "What is it?" she asked. He folded the letter before she could see it. The motion was too quick, too practiced. "Nothing you need to carry," he said. It was the first time he had ever lied to her, and she felt it land exactly the way a lie lands when it comes from someone you have begun to trust. Small, precise, and absolutely unlike everything that had come before. She walked away that night with a question lodged beneath her ribs, sharper than anything Lady Varel had ever planted there, because this one came from somewhere she had not been guarding. What was he not telling her? If you're still here with me, and somehow I think you are, subscribe to Elf Stories. There are stories like this one waiting, and every single one of them was made to be felt. We'll see you in the next one. Winter settled over the Varel estate, the way grief settles over a house, quietly, without announcement, until you realize one morning that it has been there for some time, and you simply hadn't named it yet. They did not speak of the letter, not that night, not the next, and not in the careful week of close, deliberate conversations that followed, in which both of them talked about almost everything, except the thing now sitting between them. She told herself she was being patient. She knew, when she was honest, that what she was being was afraid. Afraid that asking would break something she was not yet certain was durable enough to survive the truth. There was an evening deep in the season's cold when a storm came on without warning and caught them both crossing the grounds. The old gardener's shed was the nearest shelter, and they ran for it and stood inside it in the sudden quiet, close enough to share warmth without addressing why they did not move apart, watching frost climb the single window in elaborate, indifferent patterns. He did not touch her. He did not need to. She was aware of the nearness of him the way one is aware of fire, not through contact, but through the simple fact of heat existing where it had not been a moment before. I keep telling myself this is foolish, he said quietly to the window. Which part? All of it. You, me. The fact that I think about you more than I think about the thing I was sent here to do. He turned, and when he looked at her, there was none of the careful diplomatic architecture he wore for everyone else. Just his face, simply his. I was raised to believe that wanting the wrong thing was a man's gravest failure, and I have never wanted anything as foolishly or as specifically as I want this. She should have stepped back. Every rule she had built her survival on told her to step back. She did not step back. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to let someone want me without waiting for the moment it's taken away. I've never had something taken away because I've never let myself have it. And I don't know if that means I'm careful or if it means I've already lost something I never had the courage to hold. Then we'll go slowly, he said. I'm not in any hurry to take anything from you. It was not a kiss. It was smaller than that, and somehow larger. His hand finding hers in the cold, neither pulling away. The storm outside making noise against a window that suddenly felt like the only safe place in the world. She told him about Lady Varel's hallway, and the word unremarkable, and about Brienne, and about every small door that had quietly closed against her over the years, until she stopped expecting any to open. He listened without offering comfort too quickly, without rushing to fix what couldn't be fixed, simply receiving each piece of her history as though it mattered that he understood it correctly. I don't think you're unremarkable, he said finally. I think you're the most carefully hidden person I've ever met, and I don't think those are the same thing at all. She carried that sentence back across the grounds to the house and held it the way you hold something that has never belonged to you before, and you are not yet certain how. But even as the silences between them grew warmer, the world was growing colder in a different sense. Lady Varel announced within the week that her eldest daughter, Saphira, would be formally courted by Lucian before the spring thaw, an arrangement already approved, she made clear, by House Theron's patriarch, who saw in the match a chance to restore his disgraced son's standing through alliance rather than merit. Lucien's protests had been met with the particular deftness powerful families reserve for sons who have already disappointed them once. Isolde watched Saphira's hand rest on Lucien's arm at the winter feast, watched the practiced smile Saphira wore for a room that expected her to be pleased, and felt something in her chest fold in on itself with a precision that frightened her. Not rage, but something quieter and much harder to argue with. She had no claim to him. She had never let herself believe she had a claim to anything. She watched him search the crowded room for her across the heads of nobles, who would never look at her at all, and when his eyes found hers for a fraction of a second, before propriety required him to look away, she understood that he was as trapped as she was. It did not make it hurt less. Then came the second letter. It arrived the same week as the betrothal announcement. And this time, Lucien did not hide it from her. He found her in the garden the following morning and handed it to her without speaking, watching her face while she read, and she felt, before she had finished the first line, that something very large and very old was quietly changing direction. When she looked up, his face confirmed it. "I have to tell you something," he said, "and I don't know how to do it without losing you." "Then don't tell me," she said immediately, suddenly and genuinely terrified. "Not yet, please." But it was already too late for not yet. The truth had been patient long enough. "The High Court did not send me here for diplomacy," Lucien said. "They sent me here because of you, because of me." She repeated the words, the way you repeat words in a language you are still learning, testing their weight, unsure whether they mean what they appear to mean, or whether there is a grammar underneath that changes everything. Lucien set the letter on the gardener's bench between them, his hands unsteady, in a way she had never seen from him before. "Your father was not simply a minor steward who died owing debts. That is the story House Varel has told for 11 years, to everyone who asked, and to you most of all, because it was useful to them for you to believe it." Isolde felt the garden become very still around her. "What story is true then?" "Your father served the High Court directly, before he was placed with House Varel. He was not their steward by original calling. He was sent here, placed here, bound here by a promise made decades before your birth, between two great houses, sealed in old law and older blood. The promise said this, that the line of the steward and the line of the high seat would be joined. Should the high seat's bloodline ever fail to produce an heir capable of holding it through a time of conflict. "That's a fairy tale," she said. "That's what nursemaids tell stewards' daughters to make them feel less ordinary." 8 months ago, he continued quietly, the high seat's heir died. Privately, in circumstances the court has worked very carefully to contain. There is no other heir the old houses will accept, without a war beginning between them. Not a border dispute, but the kind of conflict that reshapes a realm for generations, except for one name, buried in a promise so old that no one believed it would ever need honoring. He looked at her and held her gaze with the particular steadiness of a person who understands exactly what they are giving and what it is about to cost both of them. "Yours," he said. "I was sent to find you, to confirm your bloodline, to bring you back to the high seat, if the claim proved true." She heard the words. She understood them with perfect cold clarity. And beneath the understanding, something very quiet that had been living in her chest for 11 years, some half-starved buried belief that she was more than what Lady Varel had named her, shifted, as though it had been waiting in the dark for someone to finally confirm what it had always suspected. And then, the rest of it landed. "You knew," she said, "before you ever arrived here, before I brought water to that room, before the garden, before the storm, before any of it. You knew what I was before I did. I suspected. The court's record named you by your father's blood, not by who you had become. I did not know the person, only the name." "That is not an answer to what I said." "No," he admitted, and she heard the cost of the word. "I came here carrying a purpose that had nothing to do with you as a person. I told myself that was fine, that confirming a bloodline was not the same as deceiving you. I stopped being able to tell myself that approximately 3 days after I arrived. But you still didn't tell me." "No, I didn't." She reached for anger. Anger was clean and simple, and infinitely preferable to what was actually moving through her. Betrayal, vertigo, and beneath both of them, rising despite everything, something she could not name. A sudden rearrangement, as though the image she had carried of herself for 20 years had just been turned to a different angle in the light, and what she was seeing was not a different image, but a truer one. "There's more," he said quietly, and she understood from the way he said it that the worst had not yet arrived. "Lady Varel has known for 3 weeks, since before the betrothal announcement. She did not arrange Saphira's match to me purely out of social ambition, Isolde. She arranged it to bind me to this household and delay my return to the court, to keep their interest in you buried long enough to determine what advantage she could extract from the situation. She has known what you are capable of inheriting for 11 years. Every debt House Varel owes the crown is forgiven upon the recognition of your claim, by the terms of the original promise. Every cruelty they have shown you becomes a political liability they cannot survive if the right houses learn of it." He stopped. "They have been keeping you small, not because you were worthless, Isolde, because you were worth too much." The woman who had told a 9-year-old she was unremarkable had known, the entire time, exactly how remarkable she was, and had spent 11 years building a careful, systematic campaign around making sure that girl would never find out. Isolde stood very still in the frozen garden. She thought of every meal eaten standing in a corner of the kitchen while the family dined next door. Every birthday that passed unremarked. Not because birthdays went unnoticed in that household, but because hers specifically did. Every time she had absorbed Lady Varel's gentle, precise verdicts about her own unremarkableness and filed them away as honest assessment, when they had been, all along, a strategy. It was one thing to be overlooked by people who genuinely did not see you. It was another thing entirely to discover you had been overlooked by design. To understand that someone had looked at you, recognized exactly what you were, and decided that the best use of that knowledge was to make sure you never recognized it yourself. Every word Lady Varel had ever said to her rearranged itself in her memory. Not a verdict on her worth, a strategy to conceal it. "Then everyone in that house has been lying to me my entire life," she said. "Not everyone," he said softly. "I am sorry it took this long, but I am not lying to you now. The court is sending a formal envoy within the week to confirm the claim publicly. Once that happens, there will be no more hiding it. You will be asked to come to the high seat and to decide, in front of every house that has spent years arranging itself around the assumption that you didn't matter, exactly who you intend to become." Isolde looked at the man who had omitted the truth and loved her without conditions in the very same breath, and understood that the hardest thing she had ever faced had not yet arrived. It was standing just outside the garden gate, patient as frost, waiting for her to stop standing still. The court's envoy arrived 7 days later, and House Varel's careful architecture of erasure collapsed in a single afternoon. The formalities were conducted in the main hall, the same hall where she had spent 11 years setting tables, polishing floors, carrying things from one end to the other while people with names that meant something talked around her and through her. She stood now at the center of it, not its edges, while a court official unrolled a document sealed in old wax and read aloud, in a voice designed to carry to every corner, the bloodline that connected a dead steward's daughter to a vacant throne. She heard every word with perfect clarity. She was also aware of the hall receiving them, the intake of breath from people who had just been told, in the most formal language available, that they had been hosting a potential queen and treating her as furniture. She watched Lady Varel's face move through its stages. Disbelief, then rapid calculation. Then the arrival of a warmth so new and so precisely constructed that it almost looked sincere. "Isolde, dear, we always knew there was something exceptional about you." The words arrived 11 years and one public reckoning too late to mean anything, and Isolde received them with a smile so perfectly neutral that she felt, from the slight tightening around Lady Varel's eyes, that her meaning had been understood completely. The envoy's terms were not gentle. The high seat could not remain vacant through another season. The old houses were already testing the edges of treaties that had held, only because a strong claimant sat that throne. If Isolde's claim was not formally accepted within the month, the succession would be settled the old way, through force and alliance, and the kind of war that did not end cleanly, that left a realm unrecognizable to anyone who had known it before. Her acceptance was not merely a personal choice. It was, she understood with cold clarity, the only thing standing between the realm and bloodshed, that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the accident of her blood. She was 20 years old. She had spent those 20 years being told she was incapable of consequence, and now she was being told that whether thousands of people lived in peace or died in violence depended, in measurable part, on what she decided. Lucien found her that evening in the rose garden. He told her before she could ask. She could see it in the set of his shoulders before he spoke, the particular stillness of a man who has been rehearsing a necessary truth and has finally stopped looking for a way to make it sound like something other than what it is. "The court will not accept a consort with House Theron's history," he said, and his voice was even in the way of someone for whom evenness is a discipline rather than a natural condition. "My family's history, 3 generations ago and still relevant, because in the old houses nothing is ever old enough to stop mattering, will be used by every house waiting for a reason to challenge your legitimacy. If you bring me to that throne beside you, you give them the argument they need. I would not be your strength there, Isolde. I would be your weakness. Then I'll refuse the throne," she said. The words arrived before she had finished thinking them, and she meant them, and she understood, as she said them, that she could not keep them. "You can't," he said, quietly, accurately. "You heard the envoy. If you refuse, the succession goes to war, and people who have never once wronged you will die for it. You have spent your entire life invisible, made to believe you mattered to no one, and now your choice will determine whether thousands of people live in peace or die in a conflict that begins because no one else could hold the throne. That is not something you can walk away from for me." "Then what are you asking me to do?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, the diplomatic architecture was entirely gone. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you what's true, because you deserve truth more than you deserve my comfort. The truth is, if you take the throne, you save a realm that never once earned your loyalty. You do it without me beside you, and if you walk away with me instead, you keep the one thing that has only ever been yours. But you let the wound win. The wound that taught you, since you were 9 years old, that wanting love meant giving up everything else. The impossibility of it moved through her in waves. This was not the choice the old stories described. Cold duty on one side, warm heart on the other. The answer obvious beneath the difficulty. This was harder than that. This was the question of whether the only person who had ever truly seen her could remain in her life at the exact moment she finally became visible to everyone else, and whether choosing him over the people who needed her would make her no different from every person who had ever put their own comfort above what was right. "I spent 11 years believing I mattered to no one," she said, slowly, and her voice was steady in a way she had not known she was capable of. "I built my entire understanding of myself around being unnecessary, and now I'm being told that an entire realm needs me, in a way that no one in that house ever did." She stopped. "How do I walk away from being needed, Lucien, when being needed was the only thing I ever actually wanted?" "You don't," he said softly. "I think you've known you don't since the moment the envoy read that seal. I just needed you to hear yourself say it. So it would be your choice and not mine. Then what happens to us?" He reached for her hand one last time in the cold and held it the way he had in the storm, without asking for anything in return. "I go back to whatever's left of my family's disgrace. You become something the realm will tell stories about for a very long time, and somewhere in that, we find out whether what we built in this garden was strong enough to survive distance, or whether it was only ever strong enough to survive secrecy. That's not an answer. No, he admitted. It isn't. I only have the truth. And the truth is that I would rather love you from a distance, knowing you chose to save people who never deserved your loyalty, than keep you close and watch you spend the rest of your life wondering what you let burn, because you were afraid to be needed by anyone but me. She stood in that garden, the unclaimed one, the one where the roses had grown according to their own logic, and no one had ever argued with them about it, and felt the choice crystallize in her chest with the clean, cold precision of the first frost of autumn. She thought of Lady Varel telling a 9-year-old she was unremarkable. She thought of 11 years of mended hems and unset places at tables, never meant for her. She thought of every time she had made herself smaller, quieter, easier to overlook, because small had at least been safe, and she thought of what it meant that she was being asked, not assigned, not managed, asked, for the first time in her life, by something larger than a single room. Someone wanted to know what she was capable of, and she found she wanted to know the answer badly enough to find out, even if finding it cost her the one person who had first made her believe the answer might be worth discovering. I'm going to the high seat, she said, not because I'm choosing the crown over you, because for the first time in my life, something is asking what I'm capable of instead of telling me what I'm not. And I find I want to know the answer badly enough to find out, even if it costs me the one person who taught me I was worth asking in the first place. Lucien did not argue. He pressed his forehead briefly to hers in the cold, in the unclaimed garden, in the last unguarded moment either of them would have for a very long time. Then, go be remarkable, he whispered. It's only what you already are. She left before dawn and did not look back, not because looking back didn't hurt, but because she had spent 11 years looking backward at everything she had never been allowed to have, and she was done with that direction. She walked forward, into the cold and the dark, into the shape of a life no one had ever trusted her to hold, and she carried the weight of it without putting it down. The crown was heavier than she expected, but she had learned by then to carry weight no one believed she could hold. She took the high seat in the season's last frost, before a hall that had once watched her set tables in silence, and now watched her speak without trembling, in the plain and direct voice of someone who has nothing left to perform for anyone. House Varel's debts were forgiven, as the old law required. Lady Varel's eyes, when they finally found Isolde's across the crowded hall, held something that had never once been there in 11 years of corridors and kitchens. The unmistakable look of a person who has badly misjudged what they were looking at, and knows it, and has no argument left against the knowing. Isolde held that look for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she looked away, because there were other things in that hall worth seeing now, and she was finished letting anyone else determine where her attention went. Lucien returned east, to whatever remained of his family's quiet disgrace, and for the better part of a year, the distance between them held the particular silence of two people who have said everything that could be said, and are waiting for circumstances to permit the rest. Then, on a morning that announced itself as no different from any other, a letter arrived at the high seat. No house crest, no court seal, only a hand she would have known in the dark. I heard you've become remarkable. I'd like to see it for myself, if you'll let me. She kept that letter in the place where, 11 years before, a different household had kept the truth of who she was, close, quiet, and entirely hers. Some scars do not fade. They simply stop being the only thing a person can see when they look in the mirror. Isolde never forgot the years she spent unseen. She never forgot what it was to be told, gently and with apparent certainty, that she was built for nothing in particular. She simply stopped letting those years decide what she was worth. That, in the end, was the only revolution that mattered.